Hello, and welcome to the Furthure podcast, where we explore the far reaches of the human experience, from missions to Mars, to skydiving, to blowing one's mind with psychoactive substances. These conversations offer insight into how these extreme experiences showcase the human spirit, and just might teach us how to live our everyday lives a bit better. I'm your host, Haley Maria Duran, and I study the effects of psychedelics and other out there experiences on people's minds and brains. All right, so Furthure is finally back in business. It's been a crazy 5 months since the last episode. I finished my PhD, and that is a whole story that could be its own episode, but today we're not going to get into that. But suffice to say, I am very excited for some papers that are coming focusing on psychedelics and psychosis, both from a neuroscience perspective and from a phenomenological perspective. So some cool stuff. Also, I have moved to basically the other side of the world from where I was living. I'm now in Sweden, Linköping, Sweden. So yeah, that has been why this podcast took a temporary break. But anyway, today we're here with a very exciting guest, Lisa Gezon, who is a cultural anthropologist at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I took her class while I was there, Drugs and Culture, and it was one of my favorite courses that I took while I was at UAB. She had a way of explaining how even the simplest of drugs, such as milk tea in Thailand, you might not think of that as a drug, but it's a tea, so caffeine, help create cultures and interact with various cultures. So yeah, and she also does some work with psychedelics, and I think that's really where her most interesting work is. She has been studying an integration group in Birmingham, Alabama, of all places. People might think that's a bit unlikely, but honestly, the group there is one of the strongest psychedelic communities, most supportive communities that I've ever encountered within this broader ecosystem. So she also does a good job of telling us a bit about how the integration group kind of intersected with some issues that people in the Deep South tend to face. So a lot of people who've grown up in Alabama, they might have very entrenched religious beliefs that they don't always feel completely aligned with, and might have sort of an adverse religious experience, is how she describes it. And for some people, psychedelics kind of brought about a reconciliation with these beliefs, and the group sort of helped foster a change in perspective. So I found all of that very interesting, and we also get into how kind of this psychedelic research has influenced naturalistic use culture, which is something strange to think that people kind of talk about, like, oh, I had a mystical experience. I know about the MEQ from Michael Pollan's book. Oh, all of that sort of thing. Yeah, so I hope you enjoy this episode. I went, while I was in Birmingham, to the integration circle several times. It was a very interesting community of people to be a part of, and definitely missing that group a bit in Sweden. I don't think there's quite an equivalency here. So yeah, it's a whole nother topic for a whole nother podcast. But in some ways, Sweden is quite ahead of the US, environmentally, in terms of gender equality, but with psychedelics, not so much. Pretty substantially behind in some ways, but that's a whole nother topic. We'll get into that next time. From now, let's hear about Lisa Gezon's research focused on the integration group. and we will be getting back to having regular twice-a-month episodes now, so I'm quite excited for that. I have some good stuff planned coming up, so stay tuned. So I am here with Dr. Lisa Gezon. She is an anthropologist here at UAB, and I've taken her class on drugs and culture before, and it was really phenomenal, very interesting. But she also is doing research in Birmingham, Alabama, looking at psychedelic integration groups. So maybe you could tell us a bit about what a psychedelic integration group is for people who might not know.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on your podcast. This is fun. Yeah, so the first paper I wrote that's actually published at this point is about the integration group. And people generally think about psychedelics as having several different phases. There's the preparation phase, the journey itself, and then the integration afterwards. And people, because of the plasticity of the brain and the way that the relaxed prior beliefs that happen with psychedelics, really making sense of what happens during a psychedelic journey tends to happen afterwards as people process it and think it through. There's a lot of different ways that people do that. Sometimes people do it by themselves. Sometimes people do it with their friends. Sometimes people have more formalized kind of guides like a therapist. And in the case of the integration group, there's a lot more of these springing up around the country where people get together specifically with the intention of talking about psychedelic experiences with each other. So the group that I study with started in January of 2023, and people get together and share their experiences. We break out into small groups, and there might be words or phrases or questions to think about that will prompt people to connect in a concept like hope or challenge or something like that. Connect it to their psychedelic experiences and talk with people about it. What people tend to find is that sometimes the processing in the integration group helps them realize things or emphasizes things that they might not have thought about if they were just integrating it on their own or just talking about it with people who hadn't necessarily also had psychedelic experiences or weren't psychedelic curious.
Yeah, I think it's great to kind of have an idea of an integration process that is in some way active, like people coming together to talk about their psychedelic experience around how it relates to a bunch of different words. Because a lot of times when people think about integration in psychedelics, it's kind of nebulous. Like, what does integration even mean? But it sounds like this group, they're kind of putting it into action more so.
Yeah, and it's really on a more informal basis. There are things that are published out there, particularly by psychologists, about what integration looks like. So there's some good guides out there that I don't remember the name of the exact authors, but there are some, in the psychological literature, there's some good guidelines out there for integration. This particular group that we have is very informal. There's no formal leader. We consider it to be peer-led. It's not therapist-led. So some integration groups are therapist-led and might have a more formalized kind of structure. But yeah, ours is really community-based, and it's really word of mouth, basically. That's how people find us.
So what sort of people might go to the integration group?
Interesting question. So there tend to be a number of different kinds of people. Some people, there's so many reasons why people come to psychedelics, and you're going to find representatives of a lot of those different kind of groups there. Some people are people who are in recovery processes, and they come to the integration group, and sometimes they find that it's cognitively a little challenging to come to an integration group because of the way psychedelics might be seen in their recovery communities. We also have veterans who come who are processing a lot of things and have found a lot of transformation through psychedelics. There's a lot of people in between, just people who might have just experimented with psychedelics sometimes it's just for curiosity, kind of like the psychonaut model, like how is this going to expand my consciousness? But a lot of times in this group, people are experiencing psychedelics generally intentionally in order to either grow spiritually or personally. So it's a very intentional thing. And the people who come to the group tend to have psychedelic experiences that might be more kind of solo journeys, although there are all different kinds of people having all different kinds of experiences, but there is a lot of people are having solo journeys that kind of mimic a little bit the kind of the therapeutic model or like the clinical trial models, and who are doing that intentionally to connect better with themselves, with the spirituality, or with mental health kind of issues.
That makes sense. And it really sounds like there's kind of like the full gamut present of why people use psychedelics, which people, I think, might find interesting given that Alabama is generally thought of as a very conservative sort of place, that there is in some ways like this thriving niche psychedelic community here. So maybe you could talk a bit about how like the Southeast kind of influences the group.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because when you're talking about who comes to the group, I think it's kind of also notable who doesn't come to the group. Like it tends to be more white than people of color, and sometimes that has to do with enforcement of drug laws. Because of the uneven enforcement of drug laws, there is more a sense of vulnerability. So I think that also there's a sense that I think it also influences being in the Southeast. One thing that influences it are some people don't have a lot of support for doing psychedelics outside of the integration group. So that can really influence people being there. Like they know that outside of the integration group, there's very few, if any, people they can actually talk with about it with, which is different from, say, like the Bay Area or someplace where psychedelics are probably more normalized. The other thing that I'm not sure if it's different or not, because I haven't studied other integration groups, but when, some of the topics that come up, especially towards the beginning of when the integration group first started, people were talking about religion in almost every single meeting without me prompting it at all. So my second set of writings has been about psychedelics and religion, but the only reason is because it came up so many times that after a while, I was like, okay, I'm going to start having some intentional interviews around religion just because it's come up so many times and casually. And then I had a focus group. There were 18 of us. This was a while ago, year and a half or so ago, I would say. And I just wanted to know, I was writing the paper then about what is sort of the role of the integration group in your life and how has it helped you? How has it challenged you? Has, strengths and weaknesses kind of things. And almost everyone talked about religion in one way or another. So I think a lot of people are processing their experiences with childhood religions. I mean, and not just Christianity, there's also Islam and those two mainly, but yeah. So people processing early religious experiences with psychedelics is a theme.
That's something that I guess maybe people in other areas of the country wouldn't experience as much. I don't know. But maybe you could give us some more examples of these sort of experiences people described.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and that's what I don't know. I'd be curious to learn more about how much religion comes up in other places, like particularly childhood religion. So the first paper that I wrote was with a co-author, and it's under review right now, is the relationship with religion is really vast. It can be anything from people, mostly what I found is that people who haven't had a comfortable relationship with religion and were actively practicing religion and didn't have a lot of problems with it, when they do psychedelics, they tended to remain committed to that religion. The thing that I found interesting is that in none of the cases where I interviewed, if people had troubles with religion, it wasn't because of psychedelics. That because people who had a good relationship with religion, they would take psychedelics and they would find their relationship with religion kind of more profound and intensified. So that is people who had already good experiences continued to have good experiences. What I found with other people is that some people had a relationship with religion that was not necessarily like antagonistic or bad in any way, but just people didn't really connect. It felt more like an intellectual, social kind of thing and didn't really feel it profoundly on a spiritual level. And for those people a lot of people then having psychedelic experiences really helped them identify with spirituality, with what the religion was supposed to be about. So there were some aha moments like, oh, this is the body of Christ. Like, this is what communion really means. Like, this is what they're talking about. Like, this is what Jesus is really talking about. And so there were some real aha moments with people making a connection with like a mystical experience, connecting a mystical experience with this religious tradition that they might have grown up with, felt comfortable with, but never really felt deeply. The last category is people who've had adverse experiences with religion in one shape or form, and who then through psychedelics found some sort of, I don't want to say always resolution because that wasn't always the case, but in some cases, people were able to reconnect with their religion of origin. And in some cases, they just felt even better about not being religious and having rejected their religion. So there's a number of different responses people can take.
But it seems to come up repeatedly. Maybe, like, it sounds like for people who are in good standing with their religion, it's just kind of a non-specific amplifier, if you will, and they kind of lean more into it, which I guess that's a great thing if they feel supported by their community. But for people with more adverse religious experiences, it sounds like there's sort of a wider range of what can go right or wrong.
That's right. Yeah. And some people, one category I didn't mention, okay, so some people might actually return to religion, or some people would call themselves a believer again, even if they don't go to church. You know, sort of like that spiritual but not religious kind of part was also really common. A lot of people pursued other kinds of spiritual traditions, not generally other religions, although that does happen sometimes. Like I interviewed somebody who became active in an ayahuasca church, like a leader in an ayahuasca church. Some people choose different religions than what they grew up with, but a lot of people would fit into the spiritual but not religious category, but are actually actively spiritual. It's not, it's like they are actively pursuing spiritual paths. And so some of the adverse religious experiences people would have were profound in some ways, like sexual assault, for one, came up in a number of different cases in a number of different religious traditions. One was somebody who was going to school to study Tibetan Buddhism and was one of her teachers. A couple of others in Christian context, a couple in Muslim context. So it's not particular to any given religion. One was in a psychedelic religious experience where somebody was at an ayahuasca retreat. So their sexual assault can happen across the board. It's not the possession of any given religion. And another one had to do with conflicts with the teachings. Like one person had an LGBTQ plus experience where the church rejected their child in one case, and it just left them feeling like really distant from church. Like, I can't go there anymore. I can't even read the Old Testament. Like, I just can't even read the Bible. It's just not good. Another person was going through a divorce, and their very conservative church was very interpersonally supportive, very caring on an interpersonal level, but it was in the context of this belief system that felt quite oppressive, that made divorce this really bad thing. So even though the people were nice, the teachings, in a way, this person felt like led them to feel worse about their situation than they might have otherwise. In some cases, people lost their faith because of something specifically bad that happened, like the church felt unsupportive in a way. And one of them that I interviewed, it was actually because it was around psychedelics, like the adverse religious experience happened around psychedelics. Somebody was using psychedelics therapeutically. In one case, it was using ketamine in an infusion clinic, so completely legal. And when their church learned about it, they excommunicated them.
That to me is just completely absurd, especially considering they're doing something legal and prescribable. And it's like, you can't even follow like mental health interventions then. So What was the reasoning behind the excommunication? Did they explain it at all?
They just said that it was, some of it was around the church's teachings, that they felt like any form of psychedelics, so it wasn't about the legality, that any form of psychedelics would open one up to demons, to demon possession. So it was about the vulnerability of that plastic state, the non-specific amplifier they were afraid was going to amplify something evil.
I don't even know how one would get that. I don't think they were writing a ton about psychedelics in biblical times, so I'm not sure how they thought of that, but it's just, I guess it shows that, even with psychedelics becoming more mainstream, people talking about it more for mental health reasons, there's still niche communities where this is tremendously stigmatized.
Yeah, I recently gave a paper in a context about chaplaincy and what kinds of things a study of adverse religious experiences might contribute to thinking about how to work with people from religious communities that might have very strong beliefs about psychedelics. because, you know, it's because the chaplaincy was about in the context of psychedelic chaplaincy, like how do people support people as religious chaplains, as religious leaders who are taking psychedelics. So that one interview really made it very clear that a dialogue in the field that I'd always just sort of thought it seemed extra philosophical and not all that interesting to me is actually really important, which is the ontology or the existence or like what is actually happening in a psychedelic experience. Because for her, she was a very educated person. She had higher degrees. She had started a PhD program studying religion and anthropology even. And she just found that her really traditional religious upbringing and the mental health explanations were sort of in conflict with one another. And even if she wanted to, say, move beyond her religious explanations, it was hard because that's how she was raised. And so she's like, when I'm having a psychedelic experience, am I experiencing a demon? Or am I processing childhood, say, sexual abuse or other forms? Is it more like a dream or is it like actually a demon? And so these ontological questions become really relevant in trying to figure out how best to work with people like that.
That is something that I don't think like the clinical trials have really paid attention to, but yet it presents a huge barrier, I imagine, for a significant number of people. Like the US is pretty religious and, you know, religious people have mental health problems, and yet there's not really an effort in how to contextualize it to people who might face these barriers.
Exactly. Yeah. So another thing that came out of that study was realizing that the importance of religious identity to overall well-being, that it's not just religion in a little box, but that one's overall social and mental health well-being is tied to religious identity for a lot of people. Also, then the vulnerability people have to the belief systems and their leaders. And that led to sort of thinking about pitfalls of overly prescriptive religious and spiritual leadership. There was another case that was interesting there. So when guides, say psychedelic guides or whatever, if they have strong religious or spiritual ideas about what somebody should be or somebody should be thinking, it can really get in the way and cause really be a big contributor to negative experiences, to some of the trauma related to psychedelics themselves. So in one case, I was interviewing somebody who had grown up very religious and very conservative. And then they had they'd taken ayahuasca a few times in a retreat setting and found it very healing, but also kind of scary because of the identity shift that was involved in moving away from Christianity. At one of them, it was a very healing journey. The guides were telling them to get rid of the old religious beliefs, just get rid of that old Christianity and sort of replace it with whatever it was that they were presenting in the ayahuasca retreat. And that was both a helpful message, like not to be tied down by old religious beliefs, and yet it was also really traumatic because Christianity was all this person had known all their life. And so it made that person really vulnerable to having a pretty negative reaction afterwards.
When you say a negative reaction, what do you mean by that? What sort of experience?
Anxiety, a lot of anxiety around things. That was unexplainable. Like, it took them a while to even realize why they were experiencing that anxiety. They just had intense anxiety afterwards. And like I said, they didn't know why until they really thought about it.
Yeah, that really showcases that, you know, used in a naturalistic setting, even if it's ceremonial and people are meaning well, like there are a lot of inadvertently harmful things that can happen just with how suggestible people are.
Right. And it just shows how hard it is to scale anything up, because things are there's so many things, there's so many triggers that it's really hard to predict in a way. You can have what you think is the best container, the best set and setting. Set meaning mindset and setting meaning the physical and other parts of the environment where it's taken, and yet not be right for that person. Like it's really hard to prescribe a perfect set and setting.
Yeah, I guess with what you have observed in the integration group in general, what would you say is like the best sort of facilitator of a meaningful experience for people?
Oh, wow. I would say it's so broad. I think that there are ways of having good set and setting in so many different contexts, and it really depends on the person. Like I said, a lot of the people doing it in the context of this group are doing more solo kinds of interior journeys, but a lot of people have really great experiences at music festivals. And, that's another place to have really powerful experiences. I'm sure clinical trials are probably another place to have either great experiences or not great experiences. I don't know if there's anything inherent. I'm sure that, one could have some guidelines about bad things, right? There are definitely clearly some things not to do. Just being in a place where one feels vulnerable for whatever reason is potentially not a good situation. Or if one goes into it having expectations that don't end up panning out, that can be stressful. If one thinks it's going to end up being a certain way and it's not, that can be a stressful situation. So I really think that there's a lot of things there's a lot of scenarios that can be good, and sometimes things don't work out and you don't know why. Sometimes there's no obvious reason.
Man, unpredictable.
Really unpredictable. I mean, would you say that that's the case in your experience as well?
I think that people can prepare and be somewhat intentional and do their best to kind of create a container. I think that can be helpful. Like if somebody goes out and, I don't know, kind of creates a mini retreat for themselves, almost like that can really facilitate a good experience. But sometimes good experiences happen randomly without like anything seeming to be causal. So yeah, it's definitely tricky. And the reverse is also true. Sometimes like the negative experiences, there's not a clear reason. So
yeah, and that's another thing that the integration group is good for. So we talk about integration, but it can also be good for preparation. A lot of people come to the integration group who are curious about psychedelics and they want to know what to expect and this kind of thing. And so it's helpful for them to be in a group of people who are willing and able to talk about their own experiences to kind of give them a little sense of what kind of container they might want to create for themselves. And in so doing, it's kind of interesting. I mean, as an anthropologist, I recognize that we're creating our own little subculture of norms and behaviors simply by sharing this stuff, right? By saying, oh, I did this and it worked out well for me. And someone says, oh, yeah, I did or I didn't. We're kind of creating norms. So yeah, that's what happens there. But so let's see. What else did I take away from this? Is the opportunities for finding joy and healing. So we talk about some of the negative things and the pitfalls, but there's also the people who would be remiss not to talk about the incredible joy and healing and relief and lightening people felt as a result of their psychedelic experiences, even in the adverse religious experiences. People talked about just healing in so many different ways. And so there's a lot of really good experiences as well as some of the negative ones.
So when people ended up kind of confronting an adverse religious experience, did they go into those experiences with the intention a lot of times of confronting that, or did it just kind of emerge naturally? Like, how did those healing experiences occur?
Yeah, let's see. They talked about the healing experience itself, not so much about whether that was a specific intention of that journey. I don't know for everybody if healing from religion specifically was an actual intention, but a lot of them had even images of Christ, Christ's love, for example, and just light and understanding that even went beyond any particular religion, where people were feeling this expansiveness and the kind of the unitive consciousness that we talk about sometimes with psychedelics, bringing about kind of the oceanic boundlessness and feeling like all religions are tied, and that the deep base message of religion is one of light and one of love. Love is one of the big themes. And it allowed some people. So I did, in addition to the integration group, I did 4 interviews with people that I found through Ligare, which is a Christian psychedelic society. And so for a lot of those people, they found, or some of those people, they found that the healing that they found through psychedelics did enable them to go back to church with a much more open heart. Feeling like the one in the LGBTQ situation felt like, first of all, they went to a church that more aligned with their values. So that's what some people did, is they just switched churches. But they also realized that if the leader doesn't agree with me, that's fine, because I know what's right. I'm my own compass. I am my own moral compass, and I don't have to rely on the supposed teachings of the church or the leadership, because I know what's right. And that is just a bigger theme that's come out for people, not even in the context of religion, is people feeling like they're, one quote sticks with me, the captain of their own ship, that they are sort of freed from social constraints that have been harmful to them or limiting, either harmful or just limiting.
Yeah, from reading your paper, it sounded like a good number of people had sort of transformative experiences over time within like the context of not only the psychedelic use, but the practice of like going to the group and sharing their stories. Maybe you could speak more broadly about.
Yeah, transformation is something that comes up a lot in the group. This question of, does it really change us? People talk about it changing them. I don't have a lot of evidence outside of what people talk about in the group, but people feel like it shifts their mentality and shifts their mindset in some meaningful ways that lead to greater self-acceptance. So yeah, I would say, and people feel like then it leads them to make decisions for themselves and their lives that are more life-giving, like maybe returning to a marriage that had been difficult, or returning to one's family in a way that was more forgiving and understanding and loving of their family, for example. Those would be some of the more concrete, transformative outcomes that I would say is, people maybe having more right relationships, less stress around their own belief systems because they have sort of a peace and a calm. There's a lot of people who are very connected to nature and to the earth and those kinds of things. People talk about those kind of connections getting nurtured through these. Now, I'm not naive, and I know that there's nothing inevitable about the kinds of belief systems that will come about or transformations that will come out as a result of doing psychedelics. I mean, we know that historically through time, psychedelics haven't always been used for sort of personal growth and spiritual growth. Sometimes they're used for very, very different things in different cultural contexts. But in our own cultural context, that is the kind of transformation that people embrace and kind of bring about through preparation and integration because of these subcultural frameworks around what psychedelics are and what they do. It can kind of encourage positive transformations because of the cultural container that we experience them in.
Yeah, it was interesting what you said earlier about the group almost facilitating the development of its own like subculture and norms. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I think it's probably true. What are some of those, I guess, norms that you've observed evolving?
Yeah, that's a good question. And some of it it's hard for me to say because I don't have a lot to compare it with. I just know that when I talk to other people in other places, and maybe you can talk about this too based on your experiences, I think the emphasis on the solo, inward, kind of more interior journey is something that's a subcultural quality of this. I think some of the subcultural elements overlap with a lot that's going on in the country in general, and sort of the psychedelic renaissance, generally speaking, which would be more connections with nature, connections, with positive connections with other people, embracing love, embracing a kind of getting over trauma, like sort of the trauma ends here kind of idea, like people exploring notions of generational trauma and how. So maybe some of the kinds of issues people are looking at, as well as the kind of practices of doing the psychedelics themselves. That's a good question. I feel like I need to think about that a little bit more. Do you have any sense of that based on your experiences? Like what might be unique? Maybe not entirely unique, like it doesn't exist anywhere else, but what are some qualities that you might find in the Birmingham area?
I've definitely seen, I'm not sure if it's specific to Birmingham, but in the time that I've been kind of involved with I guess, the broader psychedelic community, starting in like 2018 in Atlanta with Psy Atlanta, their psychedelic society there. I've definitely seen a shift where there is more emphasis on sort of the doing self-therapy almost. You know, people will be like, oh, I'm going to listen to the John Hopkins playlist on Spotify and put on eye shades, and like they're trying to replicate the clinical trials almost. And it's pretty funny in a lot of ways because those trials, like, it's not like the playlist is optimized to be especially helpful or anything like that, and people just see it as almost lending like validity to what they're doing, even though it's naturalistic use and clinical use. Even if you're trying to make your own mini John Hopkins session, I suppose, it's not really the same thing. You
say there's a shift. Do you mean that there's a difference between different geographic locations, or do you mean like a different shift over time?
I think prior to like pollen and all of that, I think people were more doing psychedelics out of curiosity. And it wasn't quite as structured, and people weren't really being like, I have this intention and stuff like that. And so I think it can be a good thing. I'm not sure that it always is, though, because then people have a lot of expectancies about what they're going to get out of the experience, about it being healing instead of just being interesting or a curiosity, perhaps.
Yeah, that is something that is interesting to me to think about. I think I probably need to visit some other areas and groups, but I do think that there is kind of a national culture around it as well, right? That you're saying comes out of the Michael Pollan books and the clinical trials and rave culture. So there's a number of different kind of subcultures within that are also kind of national in a way.
Yeah. I think I was referring more to like a historical shift rather than a geographical one. So, like pre-pollen things being not as clinical almost. I guess one thing you mentioned earlier is you've noticed that for some people, when they have a lot of expectancies, I guess, things don't go as well for them. Maybe you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, like if somebody is in a setting and they think they're going to remain highly functional, but they've taken a large dose, that might be disorienting. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the one that comes to mind first. That's a recent example that somebody talked about. I think if people might expect to have, I don't know. I can't think of any other examples. That's just the one that comes to mind.
Yeah, I thought you were referring more to like expectancies of expecting to be like relieved of depression or something like that. But it just, it sounds more like you're just...
Sorry.
Okay. It is true? Okay.
It is true, yeah. Some people just feeling disappointed, not necessarily having a really bad experience, but being really disappointed. Like, oh, I thought I was going to take psychedelics and it was going to clear up all my problems. And so they can be a little disillusioned. I noticed that. Yeah, I've noticed some of that as well. And, some people worry about their relationship with the rest of their life. Like, are people going to find out? What are people going to think? And I think that can maybe lead to some negative experiences if there's a disconnect between, like, sort of it comes to the moral level on that at that point about what's right, and like experiencing something that feels personally right, but that might not be right in one's community can lead to negative experiences as well, I think. Or like that one I talked about where an identity where something about an experience might challenge somebody's identity might be an issue. Although I didn't really run into that so much about the journey itself, but more about in the way it was integrated by the way somebody talked to them about it, telling them, kind of like overly guiding them into a particular spiritual path. I find that the spiritual path that people tend to embrace, you think about spiritual but not religious, tends to have a lot of overlaps with what we think about as New Age. And, certain people like Ram Dass and, our Eckhart Tolle, and those kind of philosophies tend to feel really life-giving to people. I think that's part of the subculture too, is turning to sort of life-giving, environment loving, sort of power of positive thinking kinds of ways of thinking about it. I see that happening in terms of the subculture and expectations.
Yeah, I definitely have seen that as well. What about How do you think the group plays a role in helping people process challenging experiences?
That's a good question. So when people will come to the group and they'll talk about having a challenging experience, so the intention of the group is really to not like give advice or talk a whole lot, although it can be open, like if somebody comes and they want more feedback than others. But some of it is sharing an experience and then hearing others echo similar experiences that might help them realize, oh, I'm not unique in feeling this way. Or somebody who might have a lot of anxiety afterwards will hear from somebody else, yeah, I had some anxiety and this is how long it lasted and this is how it felt and this is how I handled it. So I think hearing other people's similar stories are helpful, very, very helpful. I mean, it kind of makes people feel like you're not alone. And also it can be about people helping reframe things, shift their ideas of what actually happened. Like somebody might have been sort of freaked out by some very negative force, and then talking about it with the group, maybe realizing, oh, maybe it wasn't so negative. Maybe it was about me being able to say actually no to that negativity. Maybe it was about me standing up to the negativity and being strong. Maybe it was about me coming into my own power. And so really one of the things the integration group does is it creates this space for storytelling and narrative construction of the experiences. So through storytelling, people create reality. And so, you think about the psychedelic experience itself as this ineffable, there's no words for it. How do you find words for this? So the integration group provides a context where people can put a lot of things into words and process them, either by getting feedback from others or just simply being in a place where you can create a story and make it make sense to yourself. And so it's about taking something that's really impossible to put into words and creating a story that makes sense socially to yourself and to the other people around you. And oftentimes the most challenging things that people experience kind of start making sense. People say that with challenging experiences. Nobody likes to say the word bad trip anymore. It's always challenging experience. The word bad trip has gotten a bad rap in psychedelic communities because it suggests that it's something that is sort of negative, period. Whereas there's sort of the challenging experience idea is that you can get through this, that you can reinterpret what felt negative and think about it as part of a healing journey. Maybe it's part of processing something negative, facing something that you need to work through and leading to healing on that level. Sometimes it's scary things and sometimes it's confusing things. Sometimes people feel like they're going to die or that the trip will never end. And sort of the advice around that, again, this becomes, I'm going to say sort of cultural advice, not necessarily subcultural, because I think this is common on the national, international scale, even at least in terms of the psychedelic renaissance per se. But the idea that if it's whatever's negative, kind of face it. Say, if you feel like you're going crazy, well, what does it feel like to go crazy instead of being afraid of going crazy, mm-hmm. right? If you feel like you're going to die, well, what does it feel like to die? And then, or if you feel like, just that sort of thing, just kind of leaning into something and looking at it as a teacher. And again, I guess we're kind of getting into sort of the ontology questions, like what is it really? Is it really something telling you you're going to die, or is it an opportunity to reflect on the fact of death? And I feel like some of the ways that we talk about how to deal with challenging experiences are to transform it into sort of an object lesson, so to speak. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah. It's interesting because I know the original, like, oh, if you're going to die, then die. If you're going crazy, go crazy. That's, I think, a Bill Richards, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins, his, like, guidelines for psychedelic experiences that was published in Pollan's book. And it's like, oh, this is infiltrating and influencing the community. And I guess it really shows how, these cultural landmarks play a big role in how people interpret their experiences.
They do. And they make them feel less scary overall. I mean, I think one thing that the culture around psychedelics is doing is turning them from something that's really frightening, like the scrambling your brain kind of thing, like the kind of messaging that we got in the 70s, to saying that the message is that there are a lot that it's a more positive experience. I always feel like it's important to point out, like, it's easy to sort of get almost evangelical about psychedelics, like, oh, you have to do these. They're great. They're going to change your life. I think it's always really important to say that people need to feel really ready. It's not for everybody. And there are some people who have long-lasting negative experiences. And I just think that we've got to be honest about that and just realize that it's not going to be a cure-all for anybody or anything. And we need to just go in at eyes wide open. How do you feel about that whole discourse about the cautions about not being evangelical about psychedelic use?
It's strange because to me, it seems like one of the biggest sort of side effects of psychedelics is people becoming really fanatical. And being like, oh, everybody needs to do this. Timothy Leary, let's, put acid in the water supply and all of this. And I'm going to recommend it to all my friends. And, I'm going to start an ayahuasca church and blah, 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 blah. So I think that it's so interesting, the evangelicalism that can just spontaneously emerge. I don't know if you have examples of that from the group, if you've seen that there.
Well, I think in our group, we're really cautious. We're really cautious about not being that way at all. There is absolutely no pressure. If somebody comes in and they're like, I'm just curious, we're like, we'll answer whatever questions you have. I've not experienced anybody being pressured. Now, it was really interesting. I was just at a conference, and one of the people on the panel was Rick Doblin, and the other person was a lawyer, a lawyer for the psychedelic churches, under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. He was representing churches. And then there was a Baptist theologian. And the Baptist theologian, we were talking afterwards, and she's like, I was the only one up there who wasn't being evangelical about psychedelics.
How were these people being evangelical? What were they saying?
One was like, hey, come to my church. We got this church in Oregon. You should come. And the other one was just, it was less overt, but there were not a lot of cautions or guardrails. There wasn't a lot of okay, let's give the small print, which is, it may not be for everybody kind of thing.
Yeah. There's still an element of polarity there almost, because, it's oh, we need to make sure that we're being cautious and describing the potential negative effects. But there's a lot of people out there who do psychedelics and the experience is more ambiguous or neutral. Sometimes it isn't life-changing, and that's not talked about a ton. And that's maybe really more normal. So
that's a really important point. And that can lead to what you're talking about before about negative experiences that aren't bad. They're not scary kind of thing, but they can be very disappointing and disillusioning. And that would come from the people maybe who are expecting greater changes than what they experienced. One of the issues, too, that I found in doing research for the paper on religion that I'm writing is this question of what counts as mystical. So in the psychological testing realm, there's the mystical experience questionnaire, or the MEQ, which measures whether somebody's had a mystical experience or not. I don't know if you've used it in your clinical trials at all. Okay. And there are criticisms of the MEQ that say that it's really built on a lot of notions that are sort of religious, Eastern religions, Eastern philosophies about oceanic boundlessness. You're probably familiar with the MEQ more than I am, but more sort of Eastern religion kind of ideas about what mysticism is. And there was somebody who wrote a criticism of it from a Christian perspective, saying, well, maybe a mystical experience feels more like a relationship as opposed to a boundless oneness. Maybe it has to do with feeling like one has a connection with a spiritual, force or presence, as opposed to feeling like complete ego dissolution. Maybe ego dissolution isn't an inherent part of a mystical experience. So I think maybe that is one thing I've noticed, is that people go in because of this national discourse around the importance of having a sense of ego dissolution and that sort of thing, that if they don't have that, they feel like they haven't had a mystical experience, even though if you hear them talk about it, they've actually had a very profoundly spiritual experience, but they somehow feel disappointed and they discount it. And I wonder if part of it is because we have sort of a narrow idea of what mystical even is.
It's funny that you say that some Christians were reactionary sort of against the MEQ, because I've also heard Rick Strassman actually critique the whole mystical experience idea as a excessively Christian framework of all things. And he's Jewish, so I mean, it sounds like you can critique it from whatever angle, but we definitely do, I think, have some very limited ideas of, what the right sort of experience to have is with like ego dissolution, the MEQ, like all of that. Those are a few questionnaires that were developed by like 2 research teams that were repeatedly using them, and suddenly everybody's throwing around a Freudian psychology term. Like, what is this? So I don't even know if those sort of questionnaires are really capturing the most important things for people from the ground up,
Well, it kind of actually gets at some methodological differences between, say, psychology and more quantitative versus qualitative studies. Because if you're going to do quantitative studies, then you need to put things into boxes because you have to measure them, right? And also, I think psychologists tend to like models and for things that kind of boil a lot of complex reality down into categories. Is that right? I mean, you're coming from psychology, so.
It depends. I mean, I'm a crazy person in that on one end, I'll do like in-depth phenomenology, and then I'll be doing like neuroimaging stuff that is very, very quantitative. So I think you can do both. I don't think any discipline is strictly like limited with quantitative or qualitative or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, it definitely makes sense how that kind of the emphasis on MEQ and ego dissolution emerged. But it's funny that, people in an integration group of all places, like just naturalistically using, are being influenced by research questionnaires, essentially.
Absolutely. Oh, there's so much of that. That's the other thing I find is that there's a lot of listening to podcasts. There's a lot of sharing of podcasts. So there's a lot of integration of sort of a national culture of psychedelic renaissance, if you will, that there's a lot of sharing. And that's communication is how we have sort of a national level movement, really, is because people are sharing a lot of the same stuff and developing a lot of the same ideas. And I find people like the scientific studies to validate in a way their own experiences. They feel like it makes it somehow more real if there is a scientific study that backs it up somehow. And so people are very, very eager for the scientific studies because they think they're going to answer. I mean, and they do. They answer a lot of really important, interesting questions. And so I think there's a lot of respect. Let's just say in the most positive way, there's a lot of respect for science in the integration group that I study with.
Yeah, I would say that is definitely accurate. It's an interesting kind of blend of people being interested in new age spirituality and then science at the same time that it's kind of novel. So I mean,
yeah, and I find another kind of genre of studies that people like are scientific studies that kind of show that more new agey stuff is actually scientifically real.
Yeah, breath work and the like.
Yeah, I mean it's and I don't say that in any negative way. I mean, I think it's really fascinating. I think it's important to look at how people are willing, very scientifically based, but also very open-minded to explore otherwise not, approaches to reality that aren't necessarily traditionally considered in scientific frameworks. So it is an interesting, unique, and I think a really open-minded and a positive thing.
So one thing I've observed a bit running Further is that some people use psychedelics and they develop interesting beliefs that are often somewhat paranormal, I guess you could say, in nature, like believing that, they can exorcise demons, or that if they look at a laser on DMT, they'll see this into a simulation. Do you ever, in the integration circle, encounter people developing sort of these kinds of, I guess, spiritual or paranormal frameworks?
Yeah, what I'll say is that some people find that psychedelics gives them access to paranormal phenomena that may or may not be provable scientifically, like things like really profound embodied somatic experiences while they meditate or do psychedelics that might be akin to something like a spirit possession, or, so people are experiencing things that definitely go into the paranormal kind of realm. And they're things that may or may not be interesting to explore scientifically, but they're definitely very real as they're experienced as paranormal phenomena. So yeah, it definitely gives people access to these kinds of realms of experience that are non-ordinary.
I'll say there's people becoming sort of evangelical about psychedelics. That can happen. And like sometimes the other sort of side effect is people sort of changing their beliefs or emphasis on paranormal type of things, which is interesting because it's almost like, I've had people ask me, is that kind of saying they're becoming psychotic? Like, I don't really think so, because a lot of times these people are otherwise functional in their lives. They're not having like cognitive problems, psychosis. There's a lot of cognitive problems, people becoming very apathetic. But, with these weird or paranormal beliefs, I suppose, it seems like people are still tethered to reality fundamentally, even if they're believing in things such as being able to control gravity while tripping.
Yeah, and in some cases, what I have seen, I haven't seen people like trying to think that they can control gravity or anything, but sometimes what I'm seeing is people shifting into a realm that's maybe more spiritual as a way of knowing. Because in our society, we're so kind of rational, concrete, operational ways of knowing, whereas there are maybe more spiritual ways of knowing that might be more common in other cultural contexts that we're not really familiar with, we're not used to. And maybe some of it's people becoming fluent just in other ways of knowing.
So what is a spiritual way of knowing? Like, what even is that?
I mean, it might be things about communication with supernatural beings, with non-ordinary forces, like getting messages from maybe ancestors or from, God or something, or spirits, or spiritual forces. Maybe it might be something like that. It might be communicating with the paranormal, with supernatural forces. It might, in some cases, be about being able to call on it, although I haven't experienced that so much. For me, it's more like a shift in spiritual mindset and a way of understanding how the world operates, like Mother Earth or like trees, right? Trees and having, agency and, that sort of thing, and feeling like trees are communicating with them, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then people like to look towards science, and I think there is more science, like, the idea of what's the word for it? The mycelial, all those connections. Yeah, network. Yeah, those kinds of connections. I think people find the scientific studies that show that some of this stuff is actually, like there's some scientific basis for it, is really meaningful to people because, it makes them think, oh, we're not just crazy, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I would say I would find there is people experiencing. And we know that in a lot of non-Western traditions, people experience rocks and trees and animals as having agency, as being alive and capable of communicating. So some of it is shifting more into a kind of a not very traditional Western way of thinking that I think people find really life-giving and positive. And in a way, it's, if you want to look at people living in this world where we're this sense of losing control of the world is kind of collapsing around us environmentally and civilly. And I think that these kinds of alternative ways of knowing and being and communicating can feel positive, can feel like it gives us some real connection to a world that feels like, in a way, like it's slipping between our fingers. So I think it plays a positive role for a lot of people, regaining sort of a sense of control and communication.
Yeah, I've definitely seen people develop a way of, I guess, generating beliefs that is more emotionally based than it ordinarily would be. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that leading to like the animism sorts of beliefs and whatnot. And yeah, I wonder how much of that is really due to people just kind of merging into the psychedelic subculture where that belief is prevalent versus what part of it is actually from the psychedelics themselves.
Well,
So,
there you become, I think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy, right? Because psychedelics are not the non-specific amplifiers.
yeah.
And it becomes back to that ontology question, like what's actually going on. And I think it's impossible to tease apart.
Yeah. But there have been studies that show that psychedelics can shift people's beliefs,
Uh-huh.
but only if their beliefs are already kind of like that. So it's amplifying what they're already like. So I don't know.
I hear you. You might say also, we also live in a world where people have heard of those beliefs before. So they're not beliefs that are coming maybe completely out of the blue, right? I don't know. It is a good question, though. And it would be a good study.
Yeah.
I mean, it's part of that whole study of transformation. Like, to what extent do psychedelics transform us? I think that's another whole conversation that I think at this point is so speculative, right? Because there's like so many different levels of transformation. There are personal transformation, dealing with one's own kind of psychodynamic issues, sort of emotional and that sort of thing. There's cognitive. Does it shift the way we see things? Does it shift the way we act in the world? Those are all questions that are really interesting, both to me and to the integration group.
Mm.
And I don't know if we have great answers, but there's a lot of really thought-provoking things
Yeah.
out there around that.
It's just curious how much psychedelics seem to be able to impact people's lives and belief systems. You've studied other substances as well and observed like other communities, I guess, of use. And how would you say like the subcultures that those drugs, I guess, create are different than what you would see with psychedelics?
Well, the other main area that I studied was the drug called COTS, which is an upper, if you will. It's kind of like coffee or something in Madagascar. And, as a result of that, people don't talk about the same kind of holistic shifts in worldview, but they talk about it as making them very introspective and imagining the future differently, like imagining possibilities for people's future, like brainstorming the future, like it helps them brainstorm possibilities for their future. But it's not like a whole holistic kind of shift in perspective that psychedelics do. So people don't talk about it as really transforming them. They might talk about it as a way to think expansively about possibilities, but that's about as far, I think, as it gets in terms of being transformative. It's very social. The COT people tend to chew that together in groups, not always, but it's very, very common to chew it in groups. So it's very pro-social kind of behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, the integration group, you mentioned that there were some people going there to talk about their ketamine infusion experiences, other people participating in ayahuasca churches coming there and whatnot. So there's really a wide range of pharmacological like triggers for people to have these transformative experiences.
People aren't necessarily coming from ayahuasca churches per se. I know I did talk about somebody who had a negative experience, but that was at a ayahuasca retreat. This isn't, okay. So people aren't really like in participating in ayahuasca churches per se. But yeah, people are doing a number of different kinds of substances. A lot of people are, so some of them are doing ketamine with therapists, or at least they have in the past, or doing ketamine infusions, not that many anymore. Some people LSD, a lot of people with psilocybin. So a lot of people are experimenting with microdosing, but I find that sort of comes and goes. That seems to be something that people get curious about and then they kind of drop. But I haven't studied that scientifically, so I don't know for a fact. That's just sort of my impression.
Are there any other, observations that really stand out to you about studying the integration group? Just things that you've noticed?
Not about the integration group, but there's one more thing I want to say about my study on adverse religious experiences, is that one of the things that make the psychedelics work, or one way to look at psychedelics and adverse religious experiences, is that for the people who come out feeling more positive in terms of their spirituality, one person described it to me in a way that I found really compelling as a second naivete, which kind of brings about this idea that people start out people in a religious tradition, often as children, might feel very positive towards it and have a lot of trust that, okay, this makes sense. And then there's a middle phase of sort of conflict with that, of rejection, of question. trauma, if you will, for some people, or religious, some sort of adverse experience. And I thought about that through the angle of as a sort of a betrayal. So there was a betrayal of some of that early trust. And then the psychedelics, for some people, tend to bring around a renewed appreciation of that spirituality, but that one that's more mature and sort of seen through the lens of the psychedelic. So a second naivete, like the first naivete would be like that of a child. And then you have these renewed sort of childlike appreciation of the spiritual, but like from a more mature, integrative perspective. So that's what I would say about the religious experience thing. Back to the integration group. What I want to say about it is just what I've always said about it, is that it seems like it's an incredibly valuable community resource. We see some people coming into it and not, coming for a little while and then not coming anymore. Sometimes people just feel like they've done what they need to, and then they move on. We get referrals sometimes from therapists. There is a meetup group that is more public, that people can find it on Meetup, the psychedelic discussion group on Meetup. And sometimes those people start coming to integration groups now and then. But it just feels like a really important community asset to have a place where people can go and find like-minded people and talk about things. We found it like the quality of conversation. Some people come who are maybe psychedelic curious, don't necessarily intend on taking any. They just like to come because the conversations are very real. We have really deep, meaningful conversations, and for some people, that's really cool. That's really what they want to come for, and that's.
Yeah, I've definitely observed that people going there aren't necessarily going there to talk about psychedelics. They're going there to really connect deeply with other people, and a number of them have never done psychedelics. It's just like the conversations themselves can be psychedelic.
Yeah, they can be stimulating. And sometimes some of the things that come up about psychedelics make somebody reflect on something in their own life too. Like if psychedelics has made you reflect on your relationship with your parents, everyone can talk about that, right? And so that can be another way of thinking about one's own life, is to talk about somebody who's had kind of a paradigm shifting experience with that. The integration group also is a good place for others, thinking about other modalities. Like we used to have weekly breath work, meditation. We have a little bit of meditation at the beginning. So it's a very open-ended, open-minded space for thinking about kind of ways of connecting with self and the environment and others. I guess that's all I have to say about it, really.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.